Hi, I'm Selena, and work for Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Bracken MacLeod, who is a short fiction and novelist in the horror and suspense genre. And for readers unfamiliar with your work, Bracken, could you please tell people what exactly it is you write?
Well, that's a kind of a loaded question because I'm all over the place. It depends
Right.
on the book. The last thing I wrote, Closing Costs, is the publisher marketed it as a suspense thriller. I think of it as a horror novel in sort of the vein of like Jack Ketchum's sort of work, um, but it is very secular, or not. It's not supernatural. Uh, but I have done supernatural horror work. I wrote a book called Come to Dust, which was about dead children who come back to life. I've written crime fiction. I wrote a novella called White Knight that
Mhm.
was straight up just, crime thriller. And then my sort of big publisher debut, Stranded, was a sci-fi thriller. And so it just kind of depends on I guess, my mood when I'm writing that book, what genre I'm in. So the next
Oh,
one I'm working on right now is going to be a straight up horror novel, like supernatural horror.
ah, okay. So, what do you think draws readers to, let's say, um, the uh, the type of book that Closing Cost is?
That's a great question. I think, Closing Costs is, uh, I wrote the book because I'm a fan of home invasion thrillers, right? The classic ones like Siege of Trencher's Farm, which got made as Straw Dogs, that sort of thing. But they're kind of few and far in between, at least the really good ones are. And I wanted to do something that I hadn't seen done in a while. So hopefully what draws a reader to Closing Costs is sort of the unusual aspect of that book in a straight thriller genre and not like extreme horror. Of course, I say that, and just the year before, Paul Tremblay had released his home invasion thriller,
Yep.
Cabin at the End of the World.
Kevin.
They're nothing alike, except for that they're both home invasion thrillers. But when I say they don't get done that often, and then bam, bam, two in a row. But hopefully they're both they're I think they're both really good books. Hopefully people like them both.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the book?
Sure. The book is about a couple named Evan and Nell who sort of buy their dream home. And within a short time of living there, a man breaks into their house and takes them captive. But what none of them know is that a dark secret from Evan and Nell's past is about to catch up to them and make everything even more complicated. So the fun fact about the book is that I had written, as I mentioned, Stranded, which was a sci-fi thriller, and I had to do a ton of research because I didn't know anything about it. Set in the Arctic on an oil derrick. I didn't know anything about the oil industry, about commercial shipping. I had to do all sorts of research. So I said, the next book I write, I'm not going to do any research. I'm going to write something that I just already, is fine. So I set this book in my own house, sort of using my wife and I as models for the main characters. And it turned out to be a much harder book to write than the stupid one on the oil derrick.
So you didn't do any research for this book?
Well, I mean, I did research in the areas where I didn't know something my characters needed to know. So Nell, the main character in Closing Costs, is a mortician's assistant, and there's a moment where she's preparing a body for a funeral, and I'm not a mortician, so I needed to do some research about the details of her job in that respect to the extent that it needed to be described to the reader so that they could keep up. Right. It's not super detailed, but I needed to know more than nothing. So I did a little research on that. But the rest of the book, yeah, it's about human feeling. It's about desperation and fear and anxiety and all things that I'm very, very well acquainted with. Right. And um,
And I
and
heard
so
it's
yeah,
got
the
all,
the amount of technical research I had to do was very little.
and I heard it's got all kinds of twists and
Yes, there
turns.
are there are there are a couple of notable twists in the book that I don't want to give away,
Yes.
like I said, when their past catches up to them, it makes everything much, much more uh daunting.
Aha. Okay. So what was your favorite research story of all your books that you've written?
Oh, my favorite research story of all the books I've written is probably um is it would have to be the Come to Dust, the one about the kids who come back to life.
Mhm.
Um, because I needed to do, I mean, I don't want to say it was my favorite necessarily, but it was one of the most interesting, which is that I wanted to have this sort of um cult in the book. I was in a position where I didn't want to feel like I was misrepresenting, sort of I'm not sure how to put it. Well, sort of a religious subsect, you know.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh, this is too far. This is too far. And then I found an actual group of people who sort of have incorporated uh, a minor spoiler, who've incorporated firearms into their sort of Christian religion, and the whole thing is based around firearms. And and then I realized that this sort of cult I had imagined, which was sort of apocalyptic and militant, was not very far off from reality at all. And so it was one of those moments where it's like I wish I made things up, you know,
Mhm.
but most of the time when I have an idea, it's already something that somebody's done, and I'm just happening to fall upon it, you know. So that was a fun one because it validated something that I was feeling uncertain about when I was writing it.
Mhm. Okay. So what was actually the inspiration for Closing Costs?
For closing costs, the actual inspiration for closing costs is a scene that happens in the book, which happened to me personally, which
Mhm.
is my wife and I had moved out of Cambridge to the suburbs. We had gotten sort of priced out of the city, and we moved 20 miles outside of Boston. And and the type of person who knocks on your door changes depending on whether you're in the city or the suburbs. So when we lived in the city, it was people knocking on the door trying to sell us magazine subscriptions, or occasionally Girl Scout cookies, that sort of thing. But when you move to the suburbs, the people who knock on your door trying to sell you like solar panels and home security systems. And what happened was somebody knocks on the door, I open it, and this guy says, "Hi, Mr. MacLeod. My name is, John Smith. I happen to be in the neighborhood working for XYZ Security, and wanted to talk to you about your security system." And I'm like, okay. And then he goes on about how much he knows about us. He knows my wife's name. He knows we moved from Cambridge, all this stuff. And I felt so on my back foot during the whole conversation. Of
Oh.
course, that's the whole goal, right? Is to make me feel afraid and that I need a security system. I confronted him. I asked him, how do you know all this stuff about me? And he says, oh, well, we look up new filings at the Registry of Deeds and pull information from there so that we can get to know our potential clients. Right. So it's all very interesting. So yeah, innocent, I guess. It's all in the public record, but clearly it was made to make me feel uncertain. And so there's a scene in the book where Nell is confronted by somebody at the door who knows way too much about her and Evan. And it makes her feel unsafe in her own home. And that was sort of the broad inspiration for the book.
Wow, that's interesting. I mean, you can get so much information about somebody on the internet. It's
Oh
scary.
yeah, no, if you know which websites to go to and how to do the search, it's all out there. If you buy a house, it's recorded and searchable. And it isn't that hard to find a lot of people if you know certain basic things about them.
Mhm.
Which was kind of, like I said, the origin of this book.
Wow. And you certainly don't want to go knocking on people's doors now.
No, no. Well, geez. No, the news has been, yeah, the news from the last couple of days has just been tremendously upsetting. I imagine this guy's had to have changed his mode of sales, between the poor kid who got shot for knocking on the wrong door, and then there was a woman who got murdered. I think
Yeah.
yesterday or the day before for pulling into the wrong parking lot. And then I just read this morning about a group of girls who they were at a cheerleading conference or something, and they accidentally tried to get in the wrong car, similar car to their own. They got out of the car, got into their own car, and the guy who owned the one they were trying to get into went over to them and shot them.
Ah,
I know, it's
I
just
didn't hear
terrifying.
that.
It's the uh sort of the level of risk that you're in every day, I think, in this country. I remember I read not long ago somebody commenting online, a friend of mine from Europe, who had watched a video which was an American person who was abroad, and like a car backfired or something that almost never happens anymore, right? But a car had
Mhm.
backfired, and he immediately went into like survival mode. And all of his European friends in this European city were just kind of like unfazed because it's a car backfiring. And he kind
Mhm.
of realized how much of his life is driven by sort of fear of violence in American culture, and it was very telling. I think that when I finish the book I'm writing right now, the next one might have to be about this ambient American fear.
Interesting. So, what do you think draws people to these kinds of books, the horror type of books?
You know, I think there are a lot of reasons. Some of them are just the thrill of it. Like it's fun to get on a roller coaster. I think some of it is the fact that you can confront things in a very contained, safe way. When the when the pandemic was fresh and we were just going into lockdown, I remember seeing that one of the most popularly rented movies was Outbreak.
Mhm.
A movie about a pandemic. But I have a suspicion. It's certainly not scientific at all, but my suspicion is that people were engaging with this film in a way to make sense of what was happening to them, but in a very controlled, safe way. I can turn off the TV, I can pause the thing. And the same thing with books. I'm afraid of something bad happening, but here's a book about it, and I can sit in my room with the lights on, and a cup of tea, and read about this thing and have sort of an experimental or a rehearsal experience with it that isn't at all actually threatening.
Mhm. Okay. So, getting back to closing costs,
Mhm.
what was the biggest challenge that you had in putting out closing costs
Um, in putting it out or writing it, because those
and
are two
writing and
different.
putting it,
Yeah,
writing
those are two
and
different
putting it?
challenges. The
Yeah.
biggest challenge in writing it was that I've got a book that takes place almost entirely in a single room in a cellar. And over the course of 350 pages, trying to keep people invested in, three people in a cellar is hard work. Um, and because it's not a dynamic setting that's constantly changing and people are having car chases, it's just, you know, these things. So that was sort of the biggest challenge, was to keep the momentum of suspense, kind of amped up in the red while sitting still in a single place. In terms of releasing it, the hard part was of course the pandemic. I mean, there were a couple of things. The book came out, and then we sold it to Houghton Mifflin uh, initially. And Houghton Mifflin Harcourt then sold their trade division to HarperCollins. So as soon as the book came out, a big merger happened, right? Which confused everything, and suddenly I lost my marketing team and all of that. And then the paperback was delayed because of the international paper shortage, and so it's just kind of been like, every time we have another shot to kind of like put this book out there, we run we run out of global paper, and and here we
You would have
go.
thought
And
that, you know?
yeah, so it's just been, it's been a challenge to get this book out, and to get, sort of consciousness raised about it. And of course, when it was brand new, when it was still in hardcover, it was nobody was doing in person anything. It was all online, you know.
That's right. That's right. So, what character did you love or hate the most?
Well, I think that's pretty easy. The character I love the most in the book is Nell. She's the focus of the book. She's the one that that is sort of uh the sort of the emotional focus of the story, because the antagonist, the person I hate the most in the book, guy named Mac, um, you know, is sort of a model of toxic masculinity, and has a particular problem with her, not only as the person in this home who has the thing he wants, but also as a woman. And so in terms of hate the most in the book, Mac, because I designed him to be that way. I wanted to make a comment about male entitlement and people who think they can just take what they want without any consequences or opposition. The person I love the most in the book is Nell, because she is an amalgam of me and my wife, and kind of all of the best things about that I love the most about the two of us kind of put together in a single person. And so this was sort of, she's not really a Mary Sue, but she's certainly an insight into the character of me and my partner.
Ah. So do you put yourself in your books very often?
I tend not to put myself as a character in my books, but every book I write has an element of my
An
experience
element,
or my emotion. I feel like, people will often say, like, write what you know.
right?
And obviously they can't mean that literally, otherwise we'd never have a science fiction novel set on,
That's
Arcturian
true.
327, you know, but write what you know means write what you understand to be emotionally honest. And in order to do that, I think you have to mine your own experiences and your own emotional states, in order to write honestly about that. It's one of those things where I feel like if I want someone to, I've said it a billion times, people have heard it, if you want someone to feel a feeling while they're looking at a page, you have to feel that feeling while you're, at the keyboard. And necessarily that means mining personal experience and
Mhm.
drawing from yourself.
So do you outline your stories or do you write them kind of this, or are you a pantser?
I'm a hard outliner. I approach it. I used to be a litigator, and I approach it kind of the same way I would approach
Right.
a trial, which is I make, I put together a very thorough outline of the story. Usually, if it's a novel, the outline could be anywhere from 16 to 20 pages. Um, in addition to, doing a dossier on all of the major point of view characters so that I know who they are. I know what cars they drive and what their favorite color is, and that may never come up in the story, but it feels like it gives them, for me, in my head, it gives them depth and a nuance of character if I know, what it is they drive. I know something about how they live, about their finances, or about their choices, or um, all sorts of different character elements that would otherwise be unexplored. So yeah, I'm a deep deep outliner, probably more than is healthy.
Okay. So what else can we expect from you in the near future?
Well, so right now I'm working on a book called, right now the slug title for it is Folk Devils. We'll see if that changes, but it's a book about, um, a journalist who's researching a 30-year-old disappearance of a child that ended up being sort of wrapped up into the satanic panic of the late 80s, early 90s. And the book is about kind of the emotional impact of that time and that moral panic on individuals and the people who sort of lived through it. I've wanted to do that for a long time because I was a teenager, at the end of the 80s, and right when the satanic panic was happening. And of course, everything that I was into was exactly what was destroying our nation. I was into heavy metal and role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons, you know, and and so I was kind of, and at the time I was living in a small town, and so I was at the center of it, just sort of like all eyes were on me as the living representative of the devil uh in this little tiny community. And so I've wanted to write that book for a long time, which I'm doing now.
That sounds great. Okay. So now I have questions about you as a writer. What
Okay.
is your what is your favorite part of being a writer, the whole writing and publishing process?
I think my favorite part of being a writer is having the ability to sit down and kind of do thought experiments about emotional states and kind of imagine what it would be like to live someone else's experience. I get no small amount of pleasure from thinking about the situations I put these people in, as hard as they are, and how would a person like that react, and how would a person like that not just react but rise to the occasion. And so sort of imagining uh extraordinary, behaviors from ordinary people, right? Which is fun, because so much we were talking about the news earlier, and so much of what you see and in the news, because the news, of course, is focused on negativity, is people not responding extraordinarily to challenges. They respond
Mhm.
negatively or they respond violently. And so just sort of my favorite part of writing is trying to imagine people at their best when the worst thing happens. That's the most fun. Um, in terms of actual publishing, I mean, it's work, right? It's a job. And so when you work with a great editor, like the editor on Closing Costs was a woman named Jamie Levine, who was just amazing, and she had incredible insights into the book and made it better. And that's so much fun to have that collaborative experience with someone, because I think a lot of people think about books as one person did it. But I've got an agent who's saying, well, this didn't quite work for me, what if? And an editor who's saying, oh, this whole thing could be explored better, can you do this more? And it's a back and forth, and a lot of art, like movies and music, it's
Mhm.
collaborative, and people give me ideas that make the book better, and I could not do it without someone like Jamie, in my corner. So that's another
Mhm.
part. That's a part of the job that is fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting that editors sometimes don't get the credit that they deserve.
They deserve it. Yeah, no, a good
Yeah.
editor, is just invaluable to a book. And, you know, and I feel like I'm lucky. I've never worked with an editor who I felt was bad, who I felt uh adversarial with. I've been very
Mhm.
fortunate to always work with really interested, good uh people with great ideas. You hear horror stories, but I haven't lived one yet.
Great. Okay, my next question is, what do you consider the most challenging part of the writing process?
The most challenging part of the writing process for me is making sure that the story is grounded enough to be believable, but still fantastical enough to spark interest in people.
Mhm.
And and it comes up often, like it's a line from Mark Twain, which is the difference between reality and fiction is that fiction has to be plausible. and
Yeah.
and so there are so many things that come up, and it's like, oh man, if I tried to write that, my agent would tell me no, no one would ever believe it. Like if I tried to write Donald Trump, he would just be like, no, it's too on the nose. It's just outlandish and could never happen, right? um and so the hardest part of writing is for me, is trying to come up with something that's novel and interesting that people haven't seen before, but isn't so outlandish that I lose them as participants in the story. Right. And like I said, when I had the sort of the gun cult in Come to Dust, I was afraid that was going to be too much, and people were going to be like, no, that had never happened. And then of course it happened.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I felt a little bit validated, like, okay, let's go.
Okay. So, what has been your favorite adventure during your writing career?
Boy, that's a great question. It's one thing that happened that was definitely sort of an adventure was when Stranded, the sci-fi novel in the Arctic, came out. Macmillan sent me, well, it was Tor that published it, under Macmillan. Tor sent me to George R. R. Martin's movie theater in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He owns a movie theater called the Jean Cocteau Theater. And so I flew, like 7 hours out to Santa Fe. I'd never been there. It's beautiful. This theater is just cool. He's got this little bookstore inside that's like half George R. R. Martin books and half other books. Right. And and I go and I'm so excited to be a part of this. And I hear that, about half the time George shows up for readings. He did not show up for my reading. And neither did anybody else. I had three people. Flew 7 hours out to Santa Fe, and read to three people. I think I sold one copy of the book, and then
Oh,
flew 7 hours home. But they put me up in a lovely hotel. It was amazing. It was just such a cool thing. But as far as like writer adventures, this one couldn't be topped. As you go you fly for hours to go to this beautiful place where people are so welcoming and the bookstore staff was great, and then it's a complete, no show. That might be my favorite writing adventure.
Okay. But that happens a lot, though.
Oh,
I
it
mean,
does. It does. And you can't predict it. It's like I'll do a bookstore event in like Ashland, and it's standing room only, and you do one at somewhere else, and it's crickets and tumbleweeds. And there's no way to predict how it's going to go. It's just sort of like, oh, is the weather good? Is there a Patriots game?
right.
It's is anyone actually, is it a day that anybody would go out, or did you plan it for a stupid day like, Wednesday in the middle of the day?
Yeah, or is there a graduation going on, or
Yeah,
you
exactly. No,
just
there's
never
so
know.
many things that can fall in. Yeah, I remember I mentioned the Patriots because I did one signing where no one showed up, and they were like, "Oh yeah, no, there was a big football game." And so of course no one's going out. I
Yeah.
had no idea because I'm not a football fan, so I'm like, "Oh, so yeah, it seems like a great time. Let's do this."
You just never know. You just never know.
You never know.
So
Yeah.
so all of these poor authors who for the first time do a book signing, and sometimes they can get really discouraged if
Oh,
nobody shows up. And it's
yes, it
like,
is
no,
discouraging.
it's normal
I saw
sometimes to
I
have
saw it I
nobody
saw
show
it
up.
recently on there was a thing on Twitter where an author whose name I forget, I can't remember. I must apologize to her because I can't remember her name, but she had posted the empty seats at her signing, at a
Hmm.
Barnes and Noble
Yep.
somewhere. And she was a best-selling writer, like but no one showed up, and she was just feeling super discouraged. And the actual great thing that happened was a whole bunch of popular, well-known writers like Ben Percy and Fonda Lee and all sorts of other people chimed in with, "Oh yeah, no, that's happened to me. That's happened to me. I've read to an empty room." And everybody kind of came together to hold this person up and say, it's not you,
Hmm.
it's it's how the job
Circumstances.
works, right?
Yeah.
And it was nice because this writer had a moment of sort of uplift within the community, which I think is rarefied, ought to happen more.
Hmm. That's great. So what is the greatest lesson that you've learned during your writing career?
Don't read reviews.
Aha.
Well, I mean, it's hard because you want validation, right? I mean, writing is lonely.
Hmm.
I talked earlier about it being collaborative, but it's collaborative within a small group of people, right?
Hmm.
And reaction to your work is sort of the biggest uh, uh, sort of interplay you get in this performative business. It's entertainment, right? And so if I'm doing a public reading and people, laugh at a line or they applaud at the end of the story, that's great. But most of the time I don't get that. And so when I started out, I would look at reviews and see what people were saying about the book. But there are sort of two things that I think are true of reviews. One is you can't write for everyone. So there's always going to be somebody who hates what you've done, no matter how good it is and how
Right.
beloved it is. There's going to be somebody who's like 1 star, wish I could give it 0, you know. And And the second thing is that I don't think reviews are for writers. Reviews are for readers. And so, they don't necessarily take writers' uh, feelings or the work they do into consideration. They take into consideration just the bare structure of the story. And that it can be as, or actually, I think it's more emotionally debilitating than going to a reading that no one shows up to. Because
Hmm.
here you go, you got a dozen people who are telling you how awful you are, as opposed to an empty room, which is value neutral, right? And so, yeah, I learned probably the most important lesson I've learned is don't read reviews. And if I believe my 5-star reviews, I have to put credence into the 1-star reviews as well. It's like just, the best way to do it is to take the things that people say when no one else is listening. You know,
Hmm.
the personal statement from an individual, I really loved your book. That's not in a space that's performative like Facebook or Twitter or Goodreads. That's just honest one-to-one. Those are the reviews you listen to because those are the ones that mean something. They took time to find you and say it in a place where literally no one else could overhear. Um, and when those come from colleagues, it's even better because they know how hard it is to do.
Hmm. Very good advice. And are what piece of advice would you want to share with other writers if you have any more?
Sort of beginning emerging writers, I
Hmm.
would say the advice I have to give is, um, I mean, there's so much, but I think the one thing that served me as a writer is there are so many. I have so many ideas. I have more ideas than I have years left in my life to write them, right?
Yep.
And they come up at inopportune times. Like I'll be halfway through a book, and this bright, shiny new sparkly thing is in front of me, and I'm a magpie, and I just want to snatch at it.
Hmm.
But I have to finish the thing I'm working on first. And so the advice is, finish the thing. Because everybody, a lot of people start writing books. A lot of people get halfway through writing a book, but not everybody finishes a book. And finishing is an accomplishment. Whether or not you sell it, whether it's publishable, finishing the book is the most important part, because until you can do that, you just don't have a book. You are a writer, obviously you're writing, but you're not going to be published without that, without being able to put the end on it. And so as a writer, I think that's probably your most important first step, is to keep your sort of eyes on the finish line, and keep running no matter how many sort of side paths appear
Hmm.
uh, all along the way.
Okay. Now, are there any clubs, groups, or organizations that might have helped you that you'd recommend to other writers?
Absolutely. Well, so I mean, we're talking from Massachusetts, from New England. The New
Right.
England Horror Writers was a great small organization for me when I was starting out. It's just filled with supportive, encouraging people who want to read other writers, who want to find new authors, and and a lot of the time who want to make connections with other writers so they can start small writing groups together, or promote each other's work. So yeah, here in this region, New England Horror Writers was great. I think the Horror Writers Association, again, for new and emerging writers, has a lot of opportunities, their mentorship program and that sort of thing. But ultimately, I think the most important thing is, when you're starting out, is to have a personal writers group, three or
Right.
four people that you share work with, who are willing to give you honest feedback, not brutal feedback, right? And people who advertise, so well, I'm brutally honest. They're usually more focused on brutality than honesty,
Yeah.
right? What you want are people who are going to give you honest feedback that's actually helpful. That is, that is a kick and a kiss. This didn't work for me, but I loved that, right?
Mhm.
And how do you make that balance? And yeah, so probably the best group that I ever belonged to as a beginning writer was my personal writing group. It was Cale Pereira and Eric Nunnally and Chris Irvin and Javed Jahangir, who all helped me kind of refine and find my voice, and push through those lonely days of not being published.
Wow. Yeah. Personal groups are really the best, I
Yeah,
think.
no,
Yeah.
they absolutely are. And the other thing I would encourage is get in a group with somebody who doesn't necessarily write exactly the same thing you write. Right. So, Chris is at the time was mostly a crime writer. Of course, his newest book, Ragged, which is amazing, is about it's still a crime novel, but it's kind of like if Wind in the Willows met Fargo. Right. And so it's got anthropomorphic animals, and it's just beautifully written. Eric, of course, does what popularly gets called urban fantasy. He's got
Right.
a werewolf detective who solves missing children crimes. Cale Pereira is a very literary writer who focuses on sort of fairy tale oriented literary writing. And all of them made me a better thriller writer by making me sort of look at the things that worked in their genres and seeing how I could incorporate all of those elements into what I did. Uh, not having a pure echo chamber is really important.
Hmm. Great. Great idea. Okay. Questions about you as a person.
All
What
right.
is what is one thing that most people don't realize about you?
uh, that's a good question, because I'm like an open book on Facebook. Like I share probably way more than I should. Something that people I don't think recognize about me is that I've actually got a fair amount of social anxiety. When I'm out in public, I'm pretty gregarious and easy to get along with, but it's getting out the door so hard. Because it's daunting, I think, because you're sort of on, and sometimes it's exhausting, and it's easier to just stay home and hang out with my family and play video games. And so, yeah, I think if you see me out in public, I'm usually pretty energetic and excited to be there. But getting there was a huge hurdle. That's a thing I don't think makes people about me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, quite a few people have said similar things. Yeah, interesting. So, what question do you wish interviewers would ask you, and what would your answer be?
Oh, that's a tough one.
It is.
I think the question that I wish people would ask me is, well, I don't know, because I've been asked a lot of great questions over the years. It's tough. I think the thing that I don't get to talk about as much as I would like is sort of finding kind of like emotional depth. I feel like, I hope that in each one of my books there's a moment of, you really really felt it, like, you were reading the page, and I caused you to despair, or I caused you to feel elated, or really afraid, and how do you do that?
Mm,
And the answer to that question, I think, is kind of what I had mentioned earlier, is that you have to mine your own experiences, and you have to find that thing that frightens you. I don't tend to write about, let's say, vampires, because I don't believe in them, and I don't find them extraordinarily scary. But I do believe in people who take other people hostage in their homes. And I find that really scary. Now, I don't think that needs to be a one-to-one. Like, if I were going to write about vampires, I would try to find some way um, to engage with the threat, with the element of the monster, which is interpersonal predation. Is that this person that you can't tell because they look like everyone else, wants to literally take a bite out of you. And so I think I would have to put it in a context of again, real world interpersonal violence, but in a metaphorical way. And that would be the way for me to bridge the gap between vampires aren't real and I don't really find them scary, too. I need to make them scary while I'm at the keyboard so that people are actually engaged with the material. Yeah, the
mm.
question the question that I wish more people would ask me is about deep emotionality and emotional connection to material.
Ah, okay. So what is or are your passions when you're not writing? And how do you make time to do the things that you love?
Yeah, that's a great question, uh, because I do have a lot of hobbies, but they always. I used to have more, but writing takes up time, and I love to video game, but I don't do it very often, because as soon as I sit down at the console and fire up my Xbox, I'm like, "Oh, I should be writing." But I
Mhm,
think you need those things in order to be a good writer. You cannot just grind 24/7. So I like video
mhm,
gaming. I'm into archery. My wife and
mm,
I have been sort of slinging arrows for decades, and I'm really into role-playing games. I love tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, and my favorite is a game called Merc Borg, which is this little bleak Swedish fantasy game, which is great. But it's a creative outlet for me that isn't monetized.
mhm.
You know, it's not a grind, it's not a side hustle. It's just pure fun and creativity, and I don't have to worry about whether my agent will like it.
Okay. And how do you make time for it?
Well, it's difficult. You kind of have to make time, right? Like, I've set my writing schedule up so that it's more or less Monday through Friday, and I leave the
Mhm,
weekends open for my family, because I value them. And I've told, you know, I remember seeing Chuck Palahniuk uh, at it was called Muse at the Marketplace. It was a literary convention here in Boston, And he had told people, if there's anything you like to do more than write, go do it. Right?
Hmm.
If you love to walk dogs, go walk dogs, or frisbee golf, or go do it. Because if you want to write, writing should be the thing that you love the most. And I think there's something to that, which is if you want to write, you need to really, really be in love with writing and make time for writing. But I think there are things you can love more than writing. I love my family more than writing. Right.
Right.
And so I make sure that I always have time for my family. I take weekends off. Um, Video gaming, I'm fortunate in that I'm a stay-at-home dad. I gave up lawyering when my son was born. And so I have a kind of an uninterrupted day to write. While he's at school, I can be a working writer. And as soon as he comes home, then I'm a stay-at-home dad again. But I have those hours. Not everybody is as privileged and as fortunate as I am in that regard. And they have day jobs. And in that case, you carve out time. You get up at 4 a.m. so that you can write before you have to go to work, or you stay up until midnight doing the work.
Mhm.
But finding time to write, I think, is harder than finding time for pleasure, because pleasure uh, always, sort of finds time for itself. It's like, oh yeah, I could sit here and read this book,
Mhm.
right? Or I could get up and do the hard work. I could go lift some weights, or write some words. And it always seems harder to find time to work than to play.
Mhm. Okay. So, what does your writing space look like?
It's a disaster. It looks like piles and piles of paper and piles of books and and D&D ice and just sort of like a lot of collectibles. I love to uh I grew up kind of poor, and I didn't have a lot of money for toys, that I wanted when I was a kid. So now as an adult, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna buy this cool toy. And so, I've got action figures all around me. It's a terrible, distracting, chaotic space, which is funny because of course my writing process is so regimented, with outlines and dossiers and a clarity of direction. But yeah, if you walked into my office, I mean, you'd wonder whether I filled it with a shovel.
So, is there any particular food or drink that you have to have with you?
No, when I was starting out, I used to have, the perfect environment. It used to be like, oh, the right music for the scene and just right lighting and the temperature and all this stuff. And then my son was born, and I realized that what I needed was time. If I had 20 minutes, I could do the work, right?
Mm.
And out of necessity, I kind of gave up the environmental ritual of writing, of finding the right chair and the right room and all of this ambiance, and just say, oh, he's at school, I've got from 9 a.m. to 2, here we go. And that's what I need,
Mhm.
because that's all I've got. And if I spend a lot of time trying to come up with the perfectly uh uh not scalding hot but not tepid cup of tea before I select the music that's perfect for this scene, I'd lose half of the day.
Okay. So do you prefer, well, it doesn't matter now then, if you prefer music or silence or whatever.
It depends. There are times where if I'm writing action, I often do try to put on music that has a faster tempo so that it keeps me mentally in a state of writing a rhythm that matches action. But most of the
Ah,
time I write in silence.
and,
Um,
does it have words or is it just instrumental music?
uh, Black metal, which often has words, but they're unintelligible. As soon
Okay.
as I can understand lyrics, it's a distraction. So I am listening to music with singing, but it's not singing that is easily followed. Yeah.
Okay. You just froze for a second, so we might have missed a little bit of
Oh,
that,
sorry about that. I was just saying I write to music with lyrics, but usually the lyrics aren't anything that's easy to understand, so it doesn't distract
okay.
me.
Okay. Um, so writers often have furry or feathered or otherwise non-human companions to help them with their work. And do you have any, and do they help or hinder you?
Sadly, I don't. We're in our household, we're all very allergic to all sorts of different
Oh,
things, and it's just not a situation, between my wife's dog allergy and cat allergy, my cat allergy, my son's allergies to everything that's, that's furred. We're a non-pet family, although we love animals and we love our friends' pets. It's nice to be able to visit them, but we can't live with them, sadly.
That's too bad. So, how important is the New England area to your book?
Hugely important. I mean, I'm a New England man, and New England sort of New England-ness ends up being a character in all of my books. Even the one that I set in the Arctic, the main character is from Gloucester originally, and so he's bringing this sort of, this Cape Ann kind of sensibility to Seattle and to the Chukchi Sea and all of this. It's the area for me is so rich with character and history and just sort of visual diversity, between the cities and the suburbs and the countryside that I can't help but want to write about New England constantly. As a writer, the area is super important to me because we have such an amazingly vibrant community of genre writers in and around the Boston area, and in the greater New England. And so just having constant sort of contact with friends and colleagues, like Chris Golden and Jim Moore and, I was going to say Jennifer McMahon, she just moved to Florida, but with creative people whose work I love and who are interesting, that's another huge part of my ability to write. I'm not sure that I would do as well if I were living in in an area with a lower concentration of colleagues.
Okay. Now I just have two more questions for you.
Okay.
Where can people find your work aside from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester? And I have to do a plug. You can get Bracken's books at Annie's if you call us at 508-796 79601. I forgot my phone number. 7960193. Or you can email us. You can email us at orders@anniesbooksworcester.com. And where else can people find your books?
There you go. Well, my books are available everywhere fine books are sold, is what they like to say. Annie's Bookstop is sort of perfect. And what I want to say is all of my books are available at like Amazon or Barnes and Noble. But what I really love is when people go to small local bookstores, Wellesley Books or Copper Dog Books or Annie's Bookstop, because those I think are the stores that really love to curate sort of lesser known and what we call mid-list authors, right? You go to Barnes and Noble and the horror section, if they have one, is a third Stephen King. But you go to Annie's Bookstop and the people there can actually talk about their favorite authors in a genre in a way that isn't just, well, we stock this one deep. It's like the fantasy section. Fonda Lee got sort of raked over the coals for this, but I think she had a point to make, which is, that half of the fantasy section in any bookstore is J.R.R. Tolkien. And while that's great, for the bookstore, because of course that's bread and butter, like those books always sell, it would be nice to see more names that are less common, right, on the shelves. And I think that's what you get from smaller bookstores, is they curate their collections a little bit more carefully and a little bit more aimed toward the kind of people who shop there. And so, yeah, go to Copper Dog, go to Annie's Bookstop, go to Wellesley Books, or even what is it, An Unlikely Story, right? All of these small local shops are where you meet booksellers, but I think of them as book soldiers, the kind of people who really advocate for their favorites.
Okay. My last question is, how can we follow your work and share your awesomeness?
I am terminally on Twitter. Now that the format is almost ruined by Elon Musk's interference, I feel like I've finally figured out how Twitter works.
Now it's going to change, right?
Now it's going to change, and I'm out in the breeze. I have a TikTok, but I don't ever use it because no one wants to see a 53-year-old guy on TikTok. that's for the kids. But yeah, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. I have an Instagram that I'm trying to be better about, and all of those are available under my name. It's usually at Bracken MacLeod, in whatever format that is. And
Okay.
and like I said, I'm searchable, I'm findable on TikTok, but don't expect too much from me there.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me,
Yeah,
and
thank you. It was a pleasure.
we hope to see you at our store sometime.
Oh, I hope so
Okay.
very soon. It's been way too long since I've been in.
All right. All right, Bracken MacLeod. We will be seeing you.